Archaeology is probably the most well-known sub-discipline within anthropology, as Indiana Jones has made the field famous. Archaeology really focuses in on what we would call material culture. That is anything that is manipulated by human beings, be it either tools or building constructs or even kind of fields of agriculture, anything that is manipulated in the past. So archaeology tends to be focused more on prehistory, which is why we get a lot of the civilization studies like Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Inca, the Maya, really fall under this category because archaeologists study kind of the building materials and artifacts that are found there. Artifacts are leftover remnants of that material culture, so it could be stone tools, or as you can see here, pottery. This bottom picture is actually a picture of a communal commode or toilet at Ephesus. So again, these are all things that would be studied, and then kind of archaeologists also do a fair amount of symbolic analysis. So again, what if we're looking at these two pictures, what could we say about the society that they occupy in terms of privacy and stuff like that while they were actually living in these areas? So archaeology, again, is the study of material culture, really looking at what is left over to try to put those pieces together to kind of paint a larger picture. Linguistic anthropology, these are the math brains within the field. They really are symbolic creatures. These individuals that are linguistic anthropologists have their own phonemic alphabet to symbolize every single human sound made. These individuals, really good at linguist anthropologists, could get dropped off in the middle of the Amazon and learn kind of a unique language that they've never been exposed to in about 2 weeks. So they break down language in a symbolic kind of mathematical way. And really, linguistic anthropology, unfortunately, is fading in terms of one of the subdisciplines that is taught at some of the universities. A lot of times these positions, I know at San Diego State, they've been looking for a linguistic anthropologist that they just cannot fill the position because there's just not a lot of people going into linguistics anymore. But it is vitally important, especially in cultural anthropology, in terms of language and or the power of language. So these are some breakdowns of what linguist anthropologists would study. Descriptive linguistics is exactly what it's kind of talking about, which is how do the symbols come together to create the language at hand. Evolutionary linguistics is looking at the tree of language in terms of where the breakoffs. Again, English is a Germanic language, Spanish is a Romantic language or Latin root. So again, there's evolutionary kind of linguistics that we can look at different groups of people and their language and how far apart their language kind of diverges. Also gives us some timeline data. Sociolinguistics is how cultures change language. And the easiest one to describe here is probably things like slang. So if you said the word texting in 1995, no one would know what you were talking about. Currently, we have created a term that then creates a concept in our brains, and we're able to convey rather kind of detailed technological information with a single term. So that's sociolinguistics. It's how society changes language. Historic linguistics, again, is going to be kind of evolutionary linguistics at times, but it also looks at maybe how our language has changed. So if you're reading transcendentalists in the 1840s, their English and the way that they write, again, they use this term methinks. And nowadays, if we heard that, we would think that it's like a Jar Jar Binks thing, that nobody talks like that anymore. But historical linguists would really look at kind of the history and then the changes, the sociolinguistic changes that have taken place in that language structure. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is very important as well. Again, this is a biological anthropology class, so this is kind of baseline overarching anthropology conversation. But Sapir-Whorf hypothesis means that Language itself determines our thoughts, which determine our behavior. So essentially what Sapir-Whorf is that we think in the language that we are taught, right? And if we don't have the terms and the concepts in our brain, we can't actually formulate those ideas. So really it's this dependency. And the example that I like to use is in kind of historic Japan, they had no word for romantic love. The closest terms they could get to it is obligation and duty, which to us don't sound like romantic love. Linguistic anthropologists went back to look and see if Japan has adequate, or not adequately, if they have applied this more kind of romantic love concept to their culture. And what they looked at was it's still not being applied in the way that the West has applied it. And again, this may be language determinant, right? The terminology that they use may not allow for that concept to build. Therefore, in society, you just don't necessarily value those things or see those things as being romantic love. So again, Sapir-Whorf is language determines thought, which determines behavior. Nonverbal language, this is kinesics. This is basically body language, right? Silence would be a version of non-verbal language. Body language, again, like folding your arms, tilting your head, nodding your head, those kinds of things are all fall under kinesics. Proxemics is the study of spacing, human spacing. Sometimes people refer to this as our bubbles. Again, in rural California, we expect people to give us our space. On the subway in New York, our proxemic culture barriers change, and we are expected to be bumped and moved. And again, our bubbles do not exist in places like that. So they are culturally determined as well. Next is cultural anthropology. Cultural anthropology is that complex whole, which includes knowledge, beliefs, arts, morals, laws, customs, and all other capabilities, habits acquired by humans as a member of society. This is Tyler, who really comes up with kind of this baseline definition of what culture is. Culture is everything to a large degree. We'll talk about the biological, cultural, environmental feedback in this class. But culture as we know it really is the whole reason why you guys are watching this lecture video and I'm actually giving this lecture video, right? It has nothing to do necessarily with the biology determining those things. Our biology determines that we need to survive, and that could be that we're gathering acorns in the forest. However, sitting here teaching and learning about anthropology is much more of a cultural derivative. So again, most of our practices that go unnoticed in terms of anthropology is everything from our food habits, eating habits, sleeping habits, religious beliefs, political ideology, how we organize ourselves, the structure of society, morals, norms, all of those other things, laws, all of those things fall under cultural anthropology. At the very baseline, cultural anthropologists utilize observation and analysis. People have been doing this forever because it is also, this I would say is instinctual, right? The part of observing and analyzing people is to determine whether or not there's a threat or there should be love, right? And our compassion and our friendship. So those things are internal. Those are survival tactics, and that is biology. However, writing those things down during the Axial Age, Buddha, Confucius, Pythagoras, Heraclitus, some of these other individuals really come up with kind of the written portion of this analysis and observation. Herodotus, first kind of ethnography is done. So again, these are, once we start writing them down, it's where we start to solidify the field. Now, nobody calls themselves anthropologists in 500 BCE. However, they are doing anthropology work. They're just not trained in the methodology. Lastly, physical and or biological anthropology. This class is really going to look at DNA and blood relations, human variation and adaptation. That could be high altitude, lung capacity, hemoglobin, oxygen levels in blood, those kinds of things. Paleoanthropology looks at our hominid evolution all the way back to kind of the proto-primates. Primatology, Jane Goodall is probably the most famous. Her study of the chimps really changed the whole field of anthropology because she observes that chimps are actually using tools. And before the definition of culture in society, a lot of it had to do with tool use. But more and more, we're kind of more placing humans in this area of symbolic metaphor, analogy place that distinguishes us between our primate relatives. We'll definitely look at great apes and other primates. And then physical attributes, again, things like sexual dimorphism. Why is it that male gorillas are much larger than female gorillas, especially if you're silverback? Those kinds of things come up as well. Physical attributes such as skin color, the lighter toned skin color so that vitamin D can be absorbed. These things all happen because of diet, environment, and culture, actually, that then have that biological aspect. So these things will also be covered in this class. So kind of expounding on what physical anthropology is, really kind of this question. A lot of people just say bones. Bones are definitely part of physical anthropology. You guys will get exposed to a lot of bone studies in this class. The biological, environmental, cultural feedback loop, there are lots of examples I can give. For instance, malaria used to not exist in human populations in terms of a disease. As soon as we started to do agriculture in kind of the Mediterranean area, we cleared fields and created an environment where mosquitoes could populate and then created malaria. Cities also, malaria, the way it's spread is that a mosquito bites a person that has malaria that's infected and or infects the person, and then it has to go to another person, right? To the mosquito it does. It has to go bite another individual to spread that. So essentially what you have is people moving into cities and large agricultural areas, setting up the environment for mosquitoes and or malaria. That obviously has a biological impact. It definitely was caused by culture because we're now growing food for large amounts of people. The biological impact is that we then get sickle cell anemia, which having sickle cell trait, not anemia itself, but the sickle cell trait allows you to survive and or reproduce because malaria cannot stick to your hemoglobin because your hemoglobin, your red blood cells are misshaped. So again, there's other feedback loops. One is recently they've discovered some of the rattlesnakes have stopped rattling. And this is because our cultural instinct was to kill off rattlesnakes. Well, which is environmental, right? And their biological adaptation is to then stop rattling because they realized that somehow that they were being killed off because they were rattling. So this is all part of this feedback loop. It's inconstant. There's no either or, which one is more powerful. I would say that culture itself currently has maybe a little bit more power to, again, human beings together can completely destroy an environment. And we're dealing with some of those things right now in the Amazon and even the Australian fires and some of those other things. So again, we have a tremendous impact in that cultural effect, but that's in terms of affecting our biology, right? Because that has an environmental effect and maybe pollution or whatnot that then affects our biology. More people are born then with childhood asthma, which then creates kind of either people having genetic mutations that cause cancer and or the opposite, which is genetic mutations that enable the person to fight off childhood asthma. Some of the other things that we're definitely going to cover is hominids, which are bipedal walking relatives that go back pretty much 7.5 million years ago with Tachidensis and Tungenensis. We'll get into the genome, which is our DNA, more about primates. We'll go old world, new world, kind of their whole development. Biocultural approach goes back to kind of that biological cultural impact. Material culture is, again, much more how maybe stone tools in our early hominids started to change even our brain development, right? The more that they use stone tools to cut meat from bone and or break bone and consume that also had impacts into our brain development. Social learning gets into a lot of the primatology and or the cultural components of primatology. So social learning is definitely impacts even our biology at the basic level.